At Fontenay, one of their priests, named Barbatin, killed an old man with a blow from his sabre. At Saint-Germain-sur-Laye, one of their captains, a nobleman, shot the solicitor of the commune and took his watch. At Machecoul, for the space of 5 weeks, they made a practice of slaughtering the Republicans at the rate of 30 a day. Each string of 30 they called a rosary. Behind this row of men there was a trench prepared, into which the men fell back as they were shot, and when, as sometimes happened, a man was still alive, he was buried as if he were dead. Such acts have been witnessed in our own times. Joubert, president of the district, had his wrists sawed off. They had handcuffs for the blues made expressly to cut the flesh. They slaughtered them in the public squares, sounding the halloo. Charette, who signed himself Fraternity Chevalier Charette, and who, like Marat, wore a handkerchief knotted around his brows, burned the city of Pornic, with the inhabitants in their dwellings. Meanwhile Carrier was frightful. Terror answered unto terror. The Breton rebel looked very much like the Greek insurgent, clad as he was in a short jacket, with a gun slung across his shoulders, leggings, wide trousers of a material not unlike fustian. The lads resembled a Greek cleft. Henry de la Rochejacqueline went into this war at the age of 21, armed with a pair of pistols and a stick. There were 154 divisions in the Vendean army. They laid regular sieges. The city of Bressuire was invested by them for 3 days. On a Good Friday, 10,000 peasants bombarded the city of Des Sables with red-hot cannonballs. They succeeded in destroying in 1 day the 14 Republican cantonments from Montigny to Courbevoie. On the high wall at Thouars, the following astonishing dialogue was heard between La Rochejacqueline and a lad. "Fellow, here I am. Lend me your shoulders to climb up on. Take them. Give me your gun. Here it is." And La Rochejacqueline leaped into the city, and thus without the aid of scaling ladders, they captured the very towers once besieged by Du Guesclin. They valued a cartridge far beyond a gold louis. They burst into tears whenever they lost sight of their village belfry. To run away seemed to them the simplest affair in the world. At such times their leaders would exclaim, "Throw away your sabots, but keep your guns." When munitions failed, they said their beads, and proceeded to take the powder from the caissons of the Republican artillery, and afterwards Delbey demanded powder from the English. On the approach of the enemy, they concealed their wounded in the tall grain or among the brakes, and came back for them after the engagement was over. They wore no uniform, and their clothing was falling to pieces. Noblemen as well as peasants wore any rags that came to hand. Roger Mouliniers was arrayed in a turban and dolman taken from the wardrobe of the Théâtre de la Flèche. The Chevalier de Beauvilliers had a barrister's gown and a lady's bonnet over a woolen cap. All wore the white belt and scarf. The different grades were indicated by a knot. Stofflet wore a red knot, La Rochejacqueline a black one. Wimpfen, a semi-Girondist, and who moreover had never been out of Normandy, wore the armlets of the carabots of Caen. They had women in their ranks, Madame de Lescure, who afterwards became Madame de la Rochejacqueline, Thérèse de Malian, mistress of La Rouarie, she who burned the list of parishes, Madame de la Rochefoucauld, young and beautiful, who sabre in hand rallied the peasants at the foot of the tower of the Château Peyrouso, and Antoinette Adams, styled the Chevalier Adams, so brave that when captured she was shot standing, out of respect for her courage. This epic period was a cruel one. Men behaved like maniacs. Madame de Lescure deliberately walked her horse over the Republicans who lay disabled on the battleground. She said they were dead, but very possibly they may have been only wounded. There was occasionally a traitor among the men, but never among the women. It is true, Mademoiselle Fleury of the French theatre forsook La Rouarie for Marat, but that was for love's sake. The commanders were often as ignorant as the soldiers. M. de Sapinaud could not spell correctly. He wrote, Nous Ariens de notre côté. The leaders hated one another. The captains of the Marais cried, "Down with the mountaineers." Their cavalry was few in numbers and difficult to form. Paisset writes, "A man who would cheerfully give me his 2 sons grows cool when I ask for one of his horses." Poles, pitchforks, scythes, muskets, old and new, poachers' knives, spits, iron-pointed cudgels studded with nails. Such were their weapons. Some carried a cross made of 2 human bones. They rushed to the attack with shouts, springing up at once from all quarters, from woods, hills, underbrush, and hollow roads, ranging themselves in a circle, killing, exterminating, striking terror, and then disappearing. Whenever they passed a Republican town, they cut down the Liberty pole, set it on fire, and forming in a circle, danced around it. All their activity was displayed by night. The rule of the Vendean is to be always unexpected. They would march 15 leagues in utter silence, without so much as stirring a blade of grass. At night, their chiefs having determined in a council of war at what point the Republican posts were to be surprised the next day, they loaded their muskets, mumbled their prayers, and taking off their sabots, filed through the woods in long columns, barefoot across the heather and moss, noiseless, without uttering a sound or drawing a breath, like a procession of cats in the darkness. Chapter 6. The soul of the earth passes into man. The number of the rebels in the Vendée, including men, women, and children, cannot be estimated at less than 500,000. Tuffin de la Rouarie states the sum total of the combatants to have been 500,000. The Federalists helped them, and the Vendée had the Gironde on its side also. Lozer sent 30,000 men into the bocage. 8 departments formed a coalition, 5 in Brittany, 3 in Normandy. Ivroux, who fraternized with Caen, was represented in the rebellion by Chaumont, its mayor, and Gardembas, a man of note. Buzat, Gorsas, and Barbaroux at Caen, Brissot at Moulins, Chassin at Lyon, Rabaut Saint-Étienne at Nismes, Malin and Duchtel in Brittany, all fanned the flames of the furnace. There were 2 Vendées, the great army fighting in the forests, and the smaller one carrying on the war in the bushes. And this marks the difference between Charette and Jean Chouan. The little Vendée was simple-minded and true, the great Vendée was corrupt. The little Vendée was the better of the two. The rank of Marquis, Lieutenant General of the King's armies, was bestowed upon Charette, and he received the Grand Cross of St. Louis. Jean Chouan remained Jean Chouan. Charette resembles a bandit. Jean Chouan is more like a paladin of old. As to those magnanimous chiefs, Bonchamps, Lescure, La Roche-Jacqueline, they were mistaken. The great Catholic army was an insane attempt, upon whose heels disaster was sure to follow. Imagine a crowd of peasants storming Paris, a coalition of villages besieging the Pantheon, a chorus of Christmas hymns and prayers striving to drown the Marseillaise, a cohort of rustics rushing upon a legion of enlightened minds. Mans and Savenay chastised this folly. The Vendée could not cross the Loire. That was a stride beyond its power. Civil war can make no conquests. Crossing the Rhine confirms the power of César and adds to that of Napoleon. Crossing the Loire kills La Roche-Jacqueline. The genuine Vendée is the Vendée at home. There it is more than invulnerable, it is unconquerable. At home the Vendée is smuggler, laborer, soldier, shepherd, poacher, sharpshooter, goatherd, bell-ringer, peasant, spy, assassin, sacristan, and wild beast. La Roche-Jacqueline is only an Achilles, while Jean Chouan is a Proteus. The Vendée failed. Other revolts have been successful, that in Switzerland, for instance. The difference between mountain insurgents like the Swiss and forest insurgents like the Vendean exists in the fact that almost invariably, owing to some fatal influence of his surroundings, the former fights for an ideal, while the latter fights for a prejudice. The one soars, the other crawls. The one fights for humanity, the other for solitude. The one demands liberty, the other isolation. The one defends the commune, the other the parish. The commons, cried the heroes of Morat. The one has to do with precipices, the other with quagmires. The one is the man of torrents and foaming streams, the other of stagnant pools whence fever rises. One has the blue sky above his head, the other a thicket. One is on the mountain-top, the other among the shadows. An education that is gained upon the heights is quite a different affair from that of the shallows. A mountain is a fortress, a forest is an ambush. The former inspires courage, the latter teaches trickery. The ancients placed their gods upon a pinnacle and their satyrs within copses. The satyr is a savage, half man, half beast. Free countries have their Apennines, Alps, Pyrenees, and Olympus. Parnassus is a mountain. Mont Blanc was the gigantic auxiliary of William Tell. Looking beyond and above those titanic contests between human intellect and the darkness of night, which form the subjects of the poems of India, one sees Himalaya towering overhead. Greece, Spain, Italy, Helvetia have the mountains for their inspiration. Cimmeria, whether it be Germany or Brittany, has but the woods. The forest tends to barbarism. The formation of the soil influences man in many of his actions. It is more of an accomplice than one might imagine. When we consider certain wild scenery, we feel tempted to exonerate man and accuse nature. We are conscious of an occult provocation on the part of nature. The desert has sometimes an unwholesome influence upon the conscience, especially on one that is not enlightened. A conscience may be gigantic. Take, for example, Socrates or the Christ. It may be dwarf-like, in which case we find Atreus and Judas. A narrow conscience soon displays the attributes of the reptile. It delights to haunt the dim forests. It is attracted by the brambles, the thorns, the marshes underneath the branches, and absorbs the evil influences of the place. Optical illusions, mysterious mirages, the terrors of the hour and the place, inspire a man with that sort of half-religious, half-animal fear which in everyday life begets superstition, and in times of wild excitements degenerates into brutality. Hallucination holds the torch that lights the path to murder. A vertigo seizes the brigand. Nature, marvelous as she is, holds a double meaning that dazzles great minds and blinds the savage soul. When man is ignorant and the desert is alive with visions, the gloom of solitude is added to the blindness of the intelligence, hence the abyss that sometimes yawns in the human soul. There are certain rocks, ravines, copses, weird spaces between the trees, revealing the blackness of the night, that incite man to mad and cruel deeds. One might say that the evil fiend possesses such spots. What tragic scenes has not the gloomy hill between Bainon and Playland beheld? Wide horizons tend to enlarge the mind. Limited horizons, on the contrary, circumscribe it. Hence men naturally kind-hearted, such, for instance, as Jean Chuan, grow narrow-minded. It is the hatred of narrow minds for liberal ideas that fetters the march of progress. The Vendean War, a quarrel between the local and the universal idea, the contest of peasant and patriot, may be summed up in two words: the village community and the fatherland. Chapter 7. The Vendée has ruined Brittany. Brittany is an old rebel. In all her revolts in the past 2,000 years, she has had the right on her side until now. In her last rebellion, she was wrong. And yet, after all, whether she was fighting against revolution or against monarchy, against the acting representative or against the ruling dukes and peers, against the financial resource of the assignats or the oppression of the salt tax, whoever might be fighting, whether it were Nicolas Rapin, François de Lannoy, Captain Pluviot, and the Lady of La Garnache, or Stofflet, Coquereau, and Lechendelier de Pierreville, and whether they were fighting under M. de Rohan against the king, or under M. de la Roche-Jacqueline for the king, it was practically the same war, that of local government against centralization. These ancient provinces might be compared with a pond. Stagnant water is not inclined to flow. The wind, instead of rousing it to life, simply irritates it. France ended at Finisterre. That was the limit of the space granted to man, and there the forward march of generations ceased. Pause, cries the ocean to the land, and barbarism to civilization. Whenever it feels the influence of any excitement in Paris, whatever may be the occasion thereof, monarchy or republic, despotism or liberty, it is an innovation, and Brittany bristles with alarm and says, "Let us alone, what do you want of us?" The Marais seizes its pitchfork, and the Bocage grasps its musket. All our attempts at reform in matters of education and legislation, our philosophical systems, our men of genius, our triumphs, fail before the Ouaru. The tocsin of Bazouges holds the French Revolution in awe. The Moor of Fayeux defies the stormy assemblies on our public squares, and the belfry of Haut d'Espries declares war against the tower of the Louvre. Terrible blindness. The Vendean insurrection was a melancholy misunderstanding. An affray on a gigantic scale, wrangling among titans, a colossal rebellion fated to bequeath but one word to history, the Vendée, a glorious though melancholy word, devoting itself to death for the absent, sacrificing itself to egotism, squandering its dauntless courage, offering itself in the cause of cowards, with neither foresight nor strategy, without tactics, plan, or aim, following no leader, accepting no responsibility, showing how powerless the human will may become, uniting the spirit of chivalry with the deeds of the savage, absurdity at its height, darkness screening itself from the light, ignorance offering a determined resistance to truth, justice, right, reason, and deliverance, The terror of 8 years, the devastation of 14 departments, the ravages in the fields, the destruction of crops, the burning of villages, the ruin of cities, the massacre of women and children, the torch applied to the thatch, the sword plunged into the heart, the terror of civilization, the hope of Mr. Pitt. Such was this war, an unreasoning attempt at parricide. On the whole, the Vendée has served the cause of progress by showing the necessity of scattering the ancient shadows of Brittany, by discharging into its thickets all the arrows of Enlightenment catastrophes, have a gloomy way of settling affairs. Book I. The Three Children. 1. Plus QAM CIVILI BLLA. The summer of 1792 had been a very rainy one, but that of 1793 was so extremely warm that, although the Civil War had gone far towards ruining the roads in Brittany, the people, thanks to the fine weather, were able to travel from place to place, for a dry soil makes the best road. At the close of a clear July day, about an hour after sunset, a man on horseback, riding from the direction of Avranches, stopped before the little inn called the Croix Blanchard, situated at the entrance of Pontorson. For some years, its sign had borne the following inscription: "Good cider obtained here." The day had been a very warm one, but now the wind was beginning to rise. The traveler was wrapped in an ample cloak that fell over his horse's back. He wore a broad-brimmed hat, ornamented with a tricolored cockade, which was rather a bold thing to do in a country like this, with its hedges and sharpshooting, for which a cockade offered an excellent target. The cloak fastened around his neck was pushed back, leaving his arms free and revealing at the same time a tricolored belt and the butts of 2 pistols protruding from it, while a saber hung down below the cloak. At the sound of the horse's hoofs stopping before the inn, the door opened, and the landlord came out, holding a lantern in his hand. It was just at twilight, when it is still light out of doors, although dark within. The host glanced at the cockade. "Do you mean to stop here, citizen?" "No." "Where are you going, then?" "To Dole." "In that case, you would do better to return to Avranches, or else remain at Pontorson." "Why so?" "Because they are fighting at Dole." "Ah," said the rider. Then he continued, "Give my horse some oats." The host, having brought the trough and poured the oats into it, proceeded to unbridle the horse, which began at once snuffing and champing, while the dialogue went on. "Is this one of the requisition horses, citizen?" "No." "Does it belong to you?" "Yes, I bought him and paid for him." "Where do you come from?" "From Paris." "Not directly?" "No." "I should say not. The roads are blocked, but the post still runs." "As far as Alençon, I left it there." "Ah, it will not be long before we shall have no more posts in France. The horses are all gone. One worth 300 francs costs 600, and the price of fodder is beyond all reason. I used to be a postmaster, and now, you see, I keep a tavern. Out of 1,313 postmasters, 200 have resigned. Have you been traveling according to the new tariff, citizen?" "You mean the tariff of the 1st of May? Yes." 20 sous a post for a carriage, 12 for a gig, 5 for a van. Did you not buy this horse at Alençon?" "Yes." "And you have been traveling all day?" "Yes, since dawn." "And yesterday?" "And the day before?" "I should think so. You came by the way of Domfront and Mortain." "And Avranches?" "You had better take my advice and rest, citizen. Are you not tired? Your horse certainly is." "Horses may be tired, but men have no right to give way to fatigue." Again the host gazed at the traveler, whose face, grave, calm, and severe, was framed by gray hair. Casting a glance along the road, that was deserted as far as the eye could reach, he said, "And so you are traveling alone?" "I have an escort." "Where is it?" "My saber and pistols." The innkeeper went for a pail of water, and while he was watering the horse, he contemplated the traveler, saying to himself, "He looks like a priest, all the same." The writer continued, "You say there is fighting at Dal. Yes, they are just about ready to begin." "Who is fighting?" "One ci-devant against another." "How is that?" "I mean that the ci-devant, who is a Republican, is fighting against another who takes sides with the king." "But there is no longer a king." "There is the little fellow, but the strangest part is that the two ci-devants are related to each other." Here the writer listened attentively while the innkeeper continued. "One is a young man and the other an old one. It is the grandnephew fighting against his great-uncle. The uncle is a royalist, while the nephew is a patriot. The uncle commands the whites, the nephew the blues. Ah, they will show no mercy to each other, you may be sure. It is a war to death." "Death?" "Yes, citizen. Perhaps you might like to see the polite speeches they fling at each other's head. Here is a placard, which the old man has managed to post on all the houses and trees, and which I found had been stuck on my very door." The host held up his lantern to a square bit of paper glued upon one of the panels of his door, and as it was written in very large characters, the writer was able to read it as he sat in his saddle. "The Marquis de Lantenac has the honor to inform his grandnephew, the Viscount Gauvin, that if the Marquis is so fortunate as to take him prisoner, le Viscount may rest assured that he will be speedily shot." "And here is the reply," continued the innkeeper. He turned so as to throw the light of his lantern upon a second placard on the other panel of the door, directly opposite the first one. "Gauvin warns Lantenac that if he catches him, he will have him shot." "Yesterday the first placard was posted on my door," said the host, "and this morning came the second." He was not kept waiting for his answer. The traveler, in an undertone, as though speaking to himself, uttered certain words, which the innkeeper caught without fully understanding their meaning. "Yes, this is more than waging war against one's native land. It is carrying it into the family, and it must needs be done. Great regenerations are only to be purchased at this price." And the traveler, with his eyes still riveted to the second placard, lifted his hand to his hat and saluted it. The host continued, "You see, citizen, this is the way matters stand. In the cities and in larger towns we are in favor of revolution, but in the country they are opposed to it, which amounts to saying that we are Frenchmen in the cities and Bretons in the villages. It is a war between the peasants and the townspeople. They call us patards, and we call them rustards. They have the nobles and the priests on their side." "Not all of them," interrupted the writer. "That is true, citizen, for here we have a viscount fighting against a marquis, and I verily believe," he added aside, "that I am speaking to a priest at this minute. Which of the two is likely to gain the day?" "I should say the viscount so far, but he has a hard time of it. The old man is a tough customer. They belong to the Gauvins, a noble family in these parts, of which there are two branches. The Marquis de Lantenac is the head of the older, and the Viscount Gauvin of the younger branch. Today the two branches are fighting each other. You never see this among trees, but often among men. This Marquis de Lantenac is all-powerful in Brittany. The peasants regard him as a prince. On the very day he landed, he rallied 8,000 men. In a week 300 parishes had risen. If he had only been able to establish a foothold on the coast, the English would have made a descent. Luckily Gauvin, who, strange to say, is his grandnephew, was on the spot. He is a Republican commander and has got the upper hand of his great-uncle. And then, as good luck would have it, this Lantenac at the time of his arrival, when he was massacring a multitude of prisoners, gave orders to have 2 women shot, one of whom had 3 children, who had been adopted by a Paris battalion. This roused the rage of the battalion, which is called the Bonnetrouge. There are but few of the original Parisians left, but they are desperate fighters. They have been incorporated into Commandant Gauvin's division. Nothing can resist them. Their great object is to avenge the women and recapture the children. No one knows what the old Marquis did with the little ones, and that is what infuriates the Parisian grenadiers. Had not these children been mixed up in it, this war would not have been what it is. The Viscount is a good and brave young fellow, but the old man is a terrible marquis. The peasants call this the War of St. Michel against Beelzebub. You know, maybe, that St. Michel is the patron of these parts. There is a mountain named after him in the middle of the bay. They give him credit for conquering the devil and burying him under another hill not far away, called Tourmaline. Yes, murmured the writer, Tumba Beleni, the tomb of Belenus, Belus, Bel, Belial, Beelzebub. I see that you are well informed, and the host said to himself, he knows Latin, surely he must be a priest. Then he added, well, citizen, this war is beginning all over again for the peasants. No doubt they think the royalist general is St. Michel and the patriot commander Beelzebub, but if there is a devil, it is Lantenac, and Gauvin is an angel if there ever was one. Will you take nothing, citizen? I have my gourd and a bit of bread, but you have not told me what is going on at Dol. To be sure, well, Gauvin is in command of the exploring division of the coast. Now, Lantenac's plan was to stir up a general insurrection, to bring Lower Normandy to the aid of Lower Brittany, to throw open the door to Pitt, and to lend a helping hand to the great Vendian army in the shape of 20,000 English and 200,000 peasants. Gauvin has checkmated this plan. He holds the coast and drives Lantenac back into the interior and the English into the sea. Lantenac was here, but Gauvin dislodged him, recaptured Pontaubon, drove him out from Avranches and Villedieu, and prevented him from reaching Granville. He is maneuvering now to force him to retreat into the forest of Fougères and there to surround him. Yesterday everything was favorable, and Gauvin was here with his division. All at once, mind you, the old man, who is a shrewd one, made a point. The news came that he had marched on Dol. If he should take it, and succeeds in establishing a battery on Montdal, for he has artillery, that will give the English a chance to land, and then all is lost. That is the reason why Gauvin, who has a head on his shoulders, knowing there was not a moment to be lost, consulted no one. Nor did he wait for orders, but giving the signal to saddle, and harnessing his artillery, he collected his troops, drew his saber, and while Lantenac is hurrying towards Dol, Gauvin is all ready to pounce upon Lantenac, and Dol is to be the place where these two Breton heads will clash, and a famous crash it will be. They are at it now. How long does it take to reach Dol? For troops with artillery carriages, at least 3 hours, but they are there now. The traveler, as he listened, said, you are right, I think I can hear the cannon. The host, too, was listening. Yes, citizen, and the firing is steady. You had better spend the night here. There is nothing to be gained by going over there. I cannot stop. I must continue my journey. You are wrong. I do not know anything about your business, but the risk is great, and unless all that you hold dearest in the world is at stake. That is precisely the state of things, replied the rider. Now, supposing your son. You are very near the truth, said the rider. The innkeeper raised his head as he said to himself, and yet I thought this citizen was a priest. Then, after a moment's reflection, he added, but a priest may have children after all. Put the bridle back on my horse, said the traveler. How much do I owe you? After receiving his pay, the host put the trough and bucket against the wall and came back to the traveler. Since you are determined to go, take my advice. You must be going to St. Malo. Now then, do not go by the way of Dol. There are 2 roads, one leading through Dol and the other along the coast. There is very little difference in their length. The road along the coast passes through St. Georges de Breheny, Cherouix, and Hierle-Vivia. You leave Dol to the south and Cancale to the north, and at the end of this street, citizen, you will come to a place where the 2 roads fork, that of Dol to the left, that of St. Georges de Breheny to the right. Mark my words, if you go to Dol, you will plunge headlong into the massacre, so do not take the left-hand turning, but keep to the right. Thank you, said the traveler. And he set spurs to his horse. As it was now quite dark, he soon vanished in the gloom, and the innkeeper lost sight of him. When the traveler reached the end of the street where the 2 roads forked, he heard the voice of the innkeeper calling to him from the distance. Turn to your right. He turned to the left. Chapter 2. Dal. Dal, a Franco-Spanish city in Brittany, as the old records call it, is not really a city. It is a street, a grand old Gothic street, with rows of houses supported by pillars on both sides of it. These houses are not built in straight lines, but stand irregularly, now and then elbowing into the street, which is, to be sure, a very wide one. The rest of the town is a mere network of lanes, all leading into this great diametrical street, emptying into it, one might say, like streams into a river, with Montdal towering above it. The city, with neither gates nor walls, could not have withstood a siege, but the street was quite capable of sustaining one. The houses, like promontories, which but 50 years ago were still standing, and the two pillared galleries bordering the street, made it a strong and well-nigh impregnable redoubt. Each of the houses was a fortress in itself, and the enemy would have found himself forced to capture them one by one. Almost in the middle of the street stood the old market. The innkeeper of the Croix Blanchard had told the truth. A furious battle was raging in Dal even while he was speaking. A nocturnal duel between the whites who arrived in the morning and the blues who appeared at night had burst suddenly upon the town. The forces were unequal, the whites numbering 6,000, while the blues were only 1,500, but they fought with equal fury. Surprising as it may seem, it was the 1,500 who attacked the 6,000. A mob pitted against a phalanx. On one side were 6,000 peasants, with images of the Sacred Heart upon their leathern waistcoats, white ribbons on their round hats, Christian emblems on their leather cuffs, rosaries hanging from their belts, carrying pitchforks oftener than sabers, and carbines without bayonets, dragging a long cannon by means of ropes, wretchedly equipped, undisciplined, with no suitable weapons, yet mad with rage. On the other side were 15,000 soldiers, wearing three-cornered hats with the tricolored cockade, long-tailed coats, with broad lapels, and shoulder belts crossed, short sabers with copper hilts, muskets with long bayonets, well-drilled and disciplined, obedient though savage, knowing how to obey like men who could at need command. Volunteers like the others, but patriots withal, although barefooted and in rags, paladins in the shape of peasants fighting in defense of monarchy, barefooted heroes in the ranks of the revolution, while the life and soul of both royalists and republicans was centered in their leaders, Lantenac, the man advanced in years, and the young Gauvin. Standing side by side in the revolution with young giants like Danton, Saint-Just, and Robespierre, were the ideal and youthful forms of Hoche and Marceau, and like unto them was Gauvin. Gauvin was 30 years of age, with the chest of Hercules, the solemn eye of a prophet, and the laugh of a child. He never smoked, he neither drank nor swore. He carried a dressing case with him throughout the entire war and took great care of his nails, his teeth, and his luxuriant brown hair. Whenever they halted, it was his habit carefully to shake his commander's uniform, riddled with balls and whitened with dust as it was. Though always rushing headlong into the thickest of the fray, he had never been wounded. His voice, unusually melodious, could assume at need the imperative ring of command. He set the example of sleeping on the ground, in the wind, the rain, and the snow, wrapped in his cloak, with his charming head resting on a stone. His was a heroic and innocent soul. Let him but take a saber in his hand, he was straightway transformed. He had that effeminate aspect that changes to something formidable in battle. A thinker and philosopher withal, in short, a youthful sage. Beautiful to look upon as Alcibiades, his speech showed the wisdom of Socrates. In that grand improvisation, which men called the French Revolution, this young man at once became a leader. The division which he had formed was like a Roman legion, an army on a small scale, complete in itself. It consisted of infantry and cavalry. It had its scouts, its pioneers, its sappers, its engineers. And as the Roman legion had its catapults, this army had its cannon. 3 well-mounted pieces strengthened the division while leaving it easy to handle. Lantenac was also a military leader, but a more accomplished one, more cautious, and at the same time more daring. The veritable old hero is cooler than a younger man because he is farther removed from the heyday of life and more daring from the consciousness that he is nearer death. What has he to lose? So slight a matter. This explains the bold and yet scientific maneuvers of Lantenac. Yet on the whole, In this obstinate wrestling match between the old and the young, Gawain almost always had the advantage, and he owed this rather to chance than to anything in himself. Every sort of good fortune, even though it may be terrible, falls to the lot of youth. Victory has something feminine in its nature. Lantenac was exasperated with Gawain, first, because his nephew had defeated him, and second, because he was his nephew. What possessed him to be Jacobin? A Gawain, unruly youngster that he was, his heir, for the Marquis had no children, a great-nephew, almost a grandchild. "Ah," cried this quay's grandfather, "if he falls into my hands, I will kill him like a dog." The Republic, moreover, had good reason to feel uneasy about this Marquis de Lantenac. He had no sooner landed than its terror began. The mere utterance of his name was like a powder train spread through the Vendean insurrection, of which he straightway became the center. In a revolt of this kind, where each one is jealous of his neighbor, where each has his bush or his ravine, if a superior leader appears, the separate chiefs who have been on a level will rally round him and submit themselves to his authority. Nearly all the forest captains had joined Lantenac, and whether near or remote, they all obeyed him. Only Gavard, who had been the first to join him, had departed. And why was this? Because he had enjoyed the confidence of the Republic and been in a position of authority. Gavard had held all the secrets and had adopted the old-fashioned system of civil war, which Lantenac had come to change and replace. A successor can hardly agree with a man of that stamp. The shoe of La Rouarie was not a fit for Lantenac, and so Gavard had gone to join Bonchamp. Lantenac belonged to the military school of Frederick Roman II. He understood the art of warfare, which consists of combining the greater with the lesser. He favored neither the great Catholic and royal army, that mass of confusion destined to be crushed, nor the guerrilla troops scattered through the thickets and hedges, useful to harass, but powerless to crush. There is either no end to guerrilla warfare, or else it comes to an unfortunate one. It begins by attacking the Republic and ends by robbing a diligence. Lantenac did not propose to carry on the Breton War altogether in the open country like La Roche-Jacqueline, nor yet in the forest like Chouan. He neither approved of the Vendée nor of the Chouannerie. He believed in real warfare. He was willing to use the peasant, but he wished to support him by the soldier. He required bands for strategy and regiments for tactics. The village armies so easily disbanded he considered excellent for an attack, an ambush, or a surprise, but he felt that they lacked solidity. They were like water in his hands. He sought a solid foundation for this unstable and diffusive warfare. To the savage army of the forest, he proposed to add regular troops as a sort of pivot about which to maneuver the peasants. Had this scheme, deep-laid and terrible as it was, proved successful, the Vendée would never have been conquered. But where could regular troops be found? Where look for soldiers? Where seek for regiments and find a ready-made army? In England. Hence Lantenac's determination that the English should effect a landing. Thus do parties compromise with their consciences. He quite lost sight of the red coat, eclipsed as it was by the white cockade. Lantenac had but one idea, first to seize upon some point on the coast, and then to deliver it into the hands of Pitt. It was with this object that, seeing Dol unprotected, he had thrown himself upon it, knowing that once in possession of Dol, he could readily gain Montdol, and by means of the latter gain a footing on the coast. The spot was well chosen. From Montdol, the cannon would sweep Fresnoy on one side, and Saint-Brelade on the other would keep the fleet of Cancale at a distance, and leave the whole beach, from Raz-sur-Cauesnon to Saint-Maur-des-Sens, open to an attack. In order to ensure success, Lantenac had brought with him 6,000 of the most active men in the regiment at his disposal, together with all his artillery, 10 16-pound culverins, 1 demi-culverin, and 1 4-pounder. He proposed to establish a strong battery on Montdol, on the principle that 1,000 shots fired from 10 cannon do more execution than 1,500 fired from 5 cannon. With 6,000 men, he felt sure of success. In the direction of Avranches, they had nothing to fear, but Gawain with his 1,500 men. Towards Dina there was Leichel, to be sure, with 25,000, but he was 20 leagues away. In regard to the latter, Lantenac felt quite safe, the distance offsetting the numbers, and as for Gawain, though he was quite near, his force was very small. We may here remark that Leichel was a fool who afterwards allowed his 25,000 men to be slaughtered on the moors of Croix-Batille, a mistake for which he strove to atone by suicide. So Lantenac felt quite safe. His entrance into Dol had been sudden and stern. The Marquis de Lantenac enjoyed a hard reputation, and knowing him to be merciless, the terrified inhabitants shut themselves up in their houses without attempting resistance, and the 6,000 Vendeans installed themselves in the city after the disorderly fashion of a band of rustics. It was almost like a market ground. In default of quartermasters, they chose their own quarters, camping at haphazard, cooking in the open air, dispersing hither and yonder through the churches, dropping their muskets to take up their rosaries. Lantenac, accompanied by a few artillery officers, proceeded without delay to reconnoiter Montdol, leaving Gouge le Bruant, whom he had appointed field sergeant, in command. This Gouge le Bruant has left but an indistinct trace in history. He had two nicknames, Brise Bleu in token of his massacre of the patriots, and Emanus because there was something indescribably horrible about him. Emanus is derived from Emanes, an old Low Norman word which expresses a superhuman degree of ugliness, almost godlike in its terror, a demon, a satyr, an ogre. An old manuscript says, "With my own eyes I beheld Emanus." Today the old people in Brittany no longer know who Gouge le Bruant was, nor what Brise Bleu means, but they have a vague idea of the Emanus, whose name is interwoven with all the local superstitions. He still is spoken of in Trémorel and Plumagat, the two villages where Gouge le Bruant has left the impress of his ill-omened footstep. In the Vendée, where all the inhabitants were savages, Gouge le Bruant was the barbarian. He was a sort of cacique, tattooed all over with crucifixes and fleur-de-lis. Upon his face was the hideous, almost supernatural glow of a soul unlike that of any other human being. He was as brave in battle as Satan himself, and atrociously cruel when the battle was over. His heart, full of mysterious determinations, now urged him to acts of devotion, now to deeds of wildest fury. Did he use his reason? Yes, after a serpentine fashion. Heroism was his starting point, murder his goal. It was impossible to conceive how his resolutions, often grand in their very monstrosity, could have entered his mind. He was capable of any horror when least expected. His ferocity was on a scale of epic grandeur. Hence his peculiar surname, Emanus. The Marquis de Lantenac relied upon his cruelty, but while none could dispute the fact that he excelled in cruelty, in matters of strategy and tactics he was less efficient, and it may perhaps have been a mistake on the part of the Marquis when he made him his field sergeant. But however that may be, he left him behind in charge, with the injunction to look after matters in general. Gouge le Bruant was more of a fighter than a soldier, and guarding a town was not so much in his line as massacring a clan would have been. Still, he posted sentries. When at nightfall the Marquis, having decided upon the position of his battery, was returning to Dol, he suddenly caught the sound of cannon. Looking in the direction of the sound, he saw a red smoke rising from the street. This meant a surprise, an invasion, an attack. Fighting was going on in the town. Although not easily taken by surprise, he was now utterly amazed, for he had anticipated nothing of the sort. What could it mean? Evidently not Gauvin, for a man would hardly attack an enemy outnumbering him 4-1. Could it be Lechelle? But was it possible for him to have made such a forced march? Lechelle was improbable, Gauvin impossible. Lantenac urged on his horse. On the way he met some of the inhabitants in the act of flight, but when he questioned them, they seemed beside themselves with terror, crying, "The blues, the blues," and on his arrival he found the situation a bad one. This is what had happened. Chapter 3. Small Armies and Great Battles. On their arrival at Dol, the peasants, as we have seen, had dispersed through town, each man guided by his own fancy, as it often happens when on obéit d'amitié, as the Vendeans expressed it, a form of obedience that may produce heroes, but not well-disciplined soldiers. They had stored their artillery, together with the baggage, under the arches of the old market, and feeling weary, when they had eaten and drunk, and said their beads, they stretched themselves out in the middle of the principal street, that was encumbered rather than guarded. As night came on, most of them fell asleep, pillowing their heads on their knapsacks, some having their wives beside them, for it often happened that the peasant women followed the men. In the Vendée, women about to become mothers frequently acted as spies. It was a mild July night. The constellations shone forth against the deep blue sky. The entire bivouac, which might have been mistaken for the halt of a caravan rather than for a military encampment, gave itself up to quiet slumber. Suddenly, by the glimmering twilight, those who were still awake perceived 3 cannon leveled at the entrance of the principal street. It was Gauvin. He had surprised the guard, had entered the town, and with his division held the entrance of the street. A peasant started up, crying, "Who goes there?" and fired off his musket. A cannon shot, followed by a terrific volley of musketry, was the reply. The whole sleeping crowd sprang up with a start. It was a rude shock to be roused by a volley of grape shot from a peaceful sleep beneath the stars. The first moment was terrific. There is nothing more tragic than the confusion of a panic-stricken crowd. They snatched their weapons. Many fell as they ran yelling to and fro. Confused by the unexpected assault, the lads lost their heads and fired madly at one another. The townspeople, bewildered by all this confusion, rushed in and out of their houses, shouting to each other as they wandered helplessly about, a dismal struggle in which women and children played a part. The balls whistling through the air left streaks of light in the darkness behind them. Amid the smoke and tumult, a constant firing issued from every dark corner. The entanglement of the baggage wagons and cannon carriages was added to the general confusion. The horses, rearing, trampled upon the wounded, whose groans could be heard on every side. Some were horror-stricken, others stupefied. Officers were looking for their men, and soldiers for their officers. In the midst of all this, some there were who displayed a stolid indifference. One woman, seated on the fragment of a wall, was nursing her newborn babe, while her husband, with bleeding wounds and a broken leg, leaned against it as he calmly loaded his musket and fired at random in the darkness, killing or not, as it happened. Men lying flat on the ground fired between the spokes of the wagon wheels. At times, there rose a hideous din of clamors, and again the thundering voice of the cannon would overwhelm all. It was frightful, like the felling of trees when one falls upon the other. Gauvin from his ambush aimed with precision and lost but few men. But at last the peasants, intrepid in spite of the disaster, ended by taking the defensive. They fell back on the market, which was like a great dark fortress with its forest of stone pillars. There they made a stand. Anything that resembled a forest inspired them with courage. The Amanus did his best to atone for the absence of Lantenac. They had cannon, but to the great surprise of Gauvin, they made no use of them. This was due to the fact that the artillery officers had gone with the Marquis to reconnoiter Montdal, and the peasants did not know how to manage the culverins and demi-culverins, but they riddled with balls the blues who cannonaded them. The peasants answered the grape shot by a volley of musketry. They now had the advantage of a shelter, having heaped up the drays, the carts, the baggage, and all the small casks that were lying about in the old market, thus improvising a high barricade, with openings through which they could pass their muskets, and from which they opened a deadly fire. So rapidly had they worked, that in a quarter of an hour the market presented an impregnable front. Matters were beginning to look serious for Gauvin. The sudden transformation of a market into a fortress, and the peasants assembled in a solid mass within, was a condition of affairs which he had not anticipated. He had taken them by surprise, it is true, but he had not succeeded in routing them. He had dismounted, and holding his sword by the hilt, he stood with folded arms, gazing steadfastly into the gloom, his own figure distinctly revealed by the flame of the torch that lighted the battery, a target for the men of the barricade, of which fact he took no heed as he stood there lost in thought, while a shower of balls from the barricade fell around him. He set his cannon against their rifles, and victory is ever on the side of the cannonball. He who has artillery is sure to win the day, and his well-manned battery gave him the advantage. Suddenly a flash of lightning burst forth from the dark market. There came a report like a peal of thunder, and a bullet went crashing through a house over Gauvin's head. The barricade was paying him back in his own coin. What was going on? This was a new development. The artillery was no longer confined to one side. A second ball followed the first, embedding itself in the wall close to Gauvin, and a third ball knocked off his hat. These balls were of a caliber so heavy that they must have been fired from a 16-pounder. "They are aiming at you, Commander," cried the gunners as they put out the torch, and Gauvin, still absorbed in his reverie, stooped to pick up his hat. Someone was indeed aiming at Gauvin, and it was Lantenac. The Marquis had just reached the barricade from the opposite side. The Amanus hastened to meet him. "Monseigneur, we have been taken by surprise." "By whom?" "I do not know." "Is the road to Dinnan open?" "I believe so." "We must begin to retreat." "We have done so, many have already fled." "I am not speaking of flight, but of retreat. Why did you not use the artillery?" The men were beside themselves, and then the officers were absent. "I was to be here." "Monseigneur, I sent everything I could on to Fougères, the women, the baggage, and all useless encumbrances. But what is to be done with the 3 little prisoners?" "Do you mean the children?" "Yes." "They are our hostages. Send them on to the Tourgue." So saying, the Marquis started for the barricade, and directly after his arrival things took on another aspect. The barricade was not well constructed for artillery. There was room for but 2 cannon. The Marquis placed in position the 2 16-pounders for which embrasures were made. As he was leaning on one of the cannon, watching the enemy's battery through the embrasure, he caught sight of Gauvin. "It is he," he cried. Then, taking the swab and the ramrod, he loaded the piece, adjusted the sight, and took aim. 3 times he aimed at Gauvin and missed him, but the third shot knocked off his hat. "Bungler," murmured Lantenac, "a little lower, and I should have had his head." Suddenly the torch went out, and he had only darkness before him. "Well, let it go," he said. And turning to the peasant gunners, he exclaimed, "Let them have the grape shot." Gauvin, for his part, was also in deadly earnest. The situation had become a serious one since the development of this new phase of the conflict, and the barricade was now cannonading him. Who could tell how soon it might pass from the defensive to the offensive? The enemy numbered at least 5,000, even allowing for the dead and the fugitives, while he had no more than 1,200 serviceable men at his command. What would happen to the Republicans if the enemy should become aware of their limited number? Their roles would soon be reversed. From playing the part of assailants, he would become the object of assault. If the barricade were to make a sortie, all would be lost. What was to be done? It was out of the question to think of attacking the barricade in front. An attempt to capture it by main strength would be folly. 1,200 men could not dislodge 5,000. Imperative as it was to make an end of it, knowing as he did that delay was fatal, still he realized that to force the enemy's hand would be impossible. What was he to do? Gauvin belonged to this neighborhood. He was familiar with the town and knew that behind the old market, where the Vendians were entrenched, was a labyrinth of narrow and crooked streets. He turned to his lieutenant, the brave Captain Guitchamp, who afterwards became famous for clearing the forest of Concise, where Jean Chouan was born, and who prevented the capture of Bergneuf by cutting the rebels off from the highway that led to the pond of La Chaine. "Guitchamp," said Gauvin, "I entrust you with the command. Fire as rapidly as possible, riddle the barricade with cannonballs, and keep them busy over yonder." "I understand," said Guitchamp. "Mass the whole column with their guns loaded, and hold them in readiness for an attack." He whispered a few words in Guitchamp's ear. "It shall be done," said the latter. Gauvin continued, "Are all our drummers ready?" "Yes." "We have 9, keep 2 and give me 7. The 7 drummers silently ranged themselves in front of Gauvin. "Step forward, battalion of the Bonnetrouge," exclaimed Gauvin. 12 soldiers, one of whom was a sergeant, stepped from the ranks. "I called for the whole battalion," said Gauvin. "Here it is," replied the sergeant. "Are there but 12? Only 12 of us left." "Very well," said Gauvin. This sergeant was that very Radub, the rough and kindly soldier who, in the name of the battalion, had adopted the 3 children found in the forest of La Saudrea. It will be remarked that only half that battalion was massacred at Herben-Pale, and Radub, by good luck, was not among them. A forage wagon was standing near, and Gauvin pointed it out to the sergeant. "Let your men weave ropes of straw and bind them around their muskets to deaden the noise when they clash against each other." A minute went by. The order was silently executed in the darkness. "It is done," said the sergeant. "Take off your shoes, soldiers," continued Gauvin. "We have none," replied the sergeant. Including the drummers, they numbered 19 men. Gauvin was the 20th. "Follow me in single file," cried Gauvin. "Let the drummers go before the battalion. You will command the battalion, sergeant." He placed himself at the head of this column, and while the cannonading still continued on both sides, these 20 men glided along like shadows and plunged into the deserted lanes. Thus they proceeded for some time, skirting along the fronts of the houses. It seemed as though the whole town were dead. The citizens had taken refuge in their cellars. Every door was barred and every shutter closed. Not a light was to be seen anywhere. But through this silence, they still heard the awful din on the principal street. The cannonading went on. The Republican battery and the Royal barricades spit out their grape-shot with unabated fury. After marching 20 minutes, winding in and out, Gauvin, who had led the way unerringly through this darkness, reached the end of a lane that led into the principal street. They were now, however, on the other side of the market. The position was changed. On that side there was no entrenchment, a common mistake of barricade builders. The market was open, and one could walk in under the pillars, where several baggage wagons stood ready to leave. Gauvin and his 19 men were in the presence of the 5,000 Vendians as before, only instead of facing them, they found themselves in their rear. Gauvin whispered to the sergeant. The straw was unwound from the muskets, and the 12 grenadiers ranged themselves in a line behind the corner of the lane, while the 7 drummers, with uplifted drumstick, waited for the signal. The artillery firing was intermittent, when suddenly, during the interval between 2 discharges, Gauvin raised his sword, and in a voice that rang out like a clarion upon the silence, exclaimed, "200 men to the right, 200 to the left, the rest in the center." The drums beat, and the 12 musket shots were fired. Then Gauvin uttered the formidable battle cry of the blues. "Charge bayonets!" The effect was wonderful. All this crowd of peasants, finding themselves assailed in the rear, imagined that another army had come up from behind. At the same time, on hearing the beating of the drums, the column which held the upper part of the street and was commanded by Guitchamp began to move, sounding the charge in its turn, and starting on the run, attacked the barricade. The peasants saw themselves between 2 fires. A panic magnifies, and at such moments a pistol shot sounds like the report of a cannon. Imagination distorts every sound, and the barking of a dog seems like the roar of a lion. Let us add, moreover, that the peasant takes fright as easily as a thatch catches fire, and as quickly as a burning thatch becomes a conflagration, a panic among peasants grows into a rout, and on this occasion the flight was beyond description. In a few moments the market was deserted, the terrified lads scattered in all directions, and the officers were helpless. The Amanus killed 2 or 3 of the fugitives, but it was of no avail. Nothing could be heard save the cry, "Sauve qui peut," and with the rapidity of a cloud driven onward by a hurricane, the entire army scattered through the streets as through the meshes of a sieve and vanished into the country. Some fled towards Chateauneuf, some towards Plurga, and others in the direction of Antrain. The Marquis de Lantenac, who was the last man to leave the scene, spiked the guns with his own hands, and then quietly and calmly took his departure, saying as he went, "It is evident that the peasants cannot be depended upon to stand their ground. we need the English. Chapter 4. A second time. They had won the victory, and turning to the men of the battalion of the Bonnet Rouge, Gauvin exclaimed, "Though you are but 12, you are equal to 1,000. One word from the chief, in times like these, was as good as the cross of honor." Guy-Champ, who had been sent by Gauvin outside the city in pursuit of the fugitives, captured many of them. Torches were lighted, and the town was searched. All those who had not been able to escape surrendered themselves. The principal street, illuminated by pots à feu, was strewn with the dead and the wounded. The fierce struggle that always terminates a battle was still continued by a few groups of desperate fighters, who, however, on being surrounded, threw down their arms and surrendered. Gauvin had observed amid the wild tumult of the flight a fearless man, vigorous and agile as a fawn, who stood his own ground while covering the flight of the others. This peasant, after handling his musket like an expert, alternately firing and rising the butt as a club until he had broken it, now stood grasping a pistol in one hand and a saber in the other, and no man dared approach him. Suddenly Gauvin saw him reel and lean against one of the pillars of the principal street. He was evidently wounded, but he still held his saber and his pistols. Gauvin put his sword under his arm and came up to him. As he called upon him to surrender, the man gazed steadily at him, while the blood oozing from his wound formed a pool at his feet. "You are my prisoner," said Gauvin. "What is your name?" "Dancer Elambe," was the reply. "You are a brave fellow," said Gauvin, extending his hand. "Long live the king," cried the man. Then gathering all his strength, and raising both hands simultaneously, he fired his pistol at Gauvin's heart, at the same time aiming a blow at his head with the saber. This movement, tiger-like in its rapidity, was yet forestalled by the action of another. A horseman had appeared on the scene. He had been there for some moments without attracting attention, and when he saw the Vendean lift his saber and pistol, he threw himself between the latter and Gauvin, intercepting the saber thrust by his own person, while his horse was struck by the pistol shot, and both horse and rider fell to the ground. Thus Gauvin's life was saved. All this took place as quickly as one would utter a cry. The Vendean also sank to the pavement. The blow from the saber struck the man full in the face. He lay on the ground in a swoon. The horse was killed. Gauvin drew near, asking as he approached if any could tell who he was. On looking at him more closely, he saw that the blood was gushing over the face of the wounded man, covering it as with a red mask and rendering it impossible to distinguish his features. One could see that his hair was gray. "He has saved my life," said Gauvin. "Does anyone here know him?" "Commander," said a soldier, "he has but just arrived in town. I saw him coming from the direction of Pontorson." The surgeon-in-chief of the division hurried up with his instrument case. The wounded man was still unconscious, but after examining him, the surgeon said, "Oh, this is nothing but a simple cut. It can be sewed, and in 8 days he will be on his feet again. That was a fine saber cut." The wounded man wore a cloak and a tricolored belt, with pistols and a saber. They placed him on a stretcher, and after undressing him, a bucket of water was brought, and the surgeon washed the wound. As the face began to appear, Gauvin studied it attentively. "Has he any papers about him?" he asked. The surgeon felt in his side pocket and drew out a pocketbook, which he handed to Gauvin. Meanwhile, the wounded man, revived by the cold water, was regaining his consciousness. His eyelids quivered slightly. Gauvin was looking over the pocketbook, in which he discovered a sheet of paper folded 4 times. He opened it and read, "Committee of Public Safety, Citizen Simmerdane." "Simmerdane," he cried, whereupon the wounded man opened his eyes. Gauvin was beside himself. "It is you, Simmerdane. For the second time you have saved my life." Simmerdane looked at Gauvin, while a sudden burst of joy, impossible to describe, lit up his bleeding face. Gauvin fell on his knees before him, exclaiming, "My master." "Thy father," said Simardane. 5. A drop of cold water. It was many a year since last they met, but their hearts had never been separated, and they knew each other again as if they had parted but yesterday. A hospital had been improvised in the town hall of Dal, and Simardane was placed on a bed in a small room adjoining the large hall devoted to the other wounded men. The surgeon who had sewed up his wound put a stop to all exciting conversation between the two men, considering it wiser to leave Simardane to sleep. Besides, Gauvin was called away by the 1,000 duties and cares incident to victory. Simardane was left alone, but he could not sleep, excited as he was by the double fever of his wound and of his joy. He knew he was not sleeping, and yet he hardly felt sure that he was awake. Could it be possible that his dream had come to pass? Simardane was one of those men who have no faith in good luck, and yet it had fallen to his lot. He had found Gauvin. He had left him a child. He found him a man, a grand, brave, awe-inspiring conqueror, and that in the cause of the people. In the Vendée, Gauvin was the pillar of the revolution, and it was really Simardane himself who had bestowed this support upon the Republic. This conqueror was his pupil. Simardane beheld his own thought illumining the youthful countenance of this man, for whom a niche in the Republican pantheon was perhaps reserved. His disciple, the child of his mind, was a hero from this time forth, and would soon become famous. It seemed to Simardane like seeing his own soul transformed into a genius. As he watched Gauvin in the battle, he had felt like Chiron watching Achilles. There is a certain analogy between the priest and the centaur, since a priest is but half a man. The incidents of this day's adventure, added to the sleeplessness caused by his wound, filled Simardane with a strange sort of intoxication. He seemed to see a youthful destiny rising before him in all its splendor, and the knowledge of his own absolute control of this destiny contributed to increase his deep joy. It needed but one more triumph like that which he had just witnessed, and at a word from Simardane, the Republic would place Gauvin at the head of an army. Nothing dazzles one so much as an unexpected success. This was the epoch of military dreams. Every man had a longing to create a general. Westermann was the hero of Danton's dream, Rossignol of Marat's, Ronson of Hébert's, and Robespierre would have liked to ruin them all. So why not Gauvin? Simardane asked himself, and thereupon he proceeded to lose himself in dreams. There were no limits to his imaginings. As he passed from one hypothesis to another, all obstacles vanished before him. For this is a ladder on which, having once set foot, one never pauses. The ascent is a long one, starting from man and ending at the stars. A great general is only the commander of an army. A great captain is also a leader of thought. Simardane pictured Gauvin as a great captain. It seemed to him, for fancies travel fast, that he saw him on the sea, pursuing the English, on the Rhine, driving before him the kings of the north, in the Pyrenees, repulsing Spain, on the Alps, setting the signal for insurrection before the eyes of Rome. Simardane was a man who possessed two distinct natures, the one tender, the other gloomy, both of which were satisfied, for since the inexorable was his ideal, it gratified him to see Gauvin at once glorious and terrible. Simardane thought of all he had to pull down before he could build up. And certainly, he said to himself, this is no time to indulge in tender emotions. Gauvin will be up à la hauteur, an expression of the day. Simardane pictured Gauvin to himself with a sword in his hand, girded in light, a flaming meteor on his brow, spreading the grand ideal wings of justice, right, and progress, and like an angel of extermination, crushing the darkness beneath his heel. Just at the crisis of this reverie, which one might almost have called an ecstasy, through the half-open door he heard men talking in the great ambulance hall adjoining his room, and he recognized Gauvin's voice, which, in spite of years of absence, had always rung in his ears. For the voice of the man often retains something of its childish tones. He listened. There was a sound of footsteps, and he heard the soldiers saying, "Here is the man who fired at you, Commander. He had crawled into a cellar when no one was watching, but we found him, and here he is." Then Simardane heard the following conversation between Gauvin and the man. "Are you wounded?" "I am well enough to be shot." "Put this man to bed, dress his wounds, take good care of him until he recovers." "I want to die." "But you are going to live. You tried to kill me in the name of the king. I pardon you in the name of the Republic." A shadow crossed Simmerdane's brow. He seemed to wake as with a start, and whispered to himself in a tone of gloomy dejection, "Yes, he has a merciful nature, there can be no doubt." Chapter 6. A healed breast, but a bleeding heart. A gash is quickly healed, but there was elsewhere one more seriously wounded than Simmerdane. This was the woman who had been shot, and whom the beggar Telmark had rescued from the great pool of blood at the farm Herben Pale. Michelle Fletchard was in a more critical condition than Telmark had supposed. There was a wound in the shoulder blade corresponding to that above her breast. One ball had broken her collarbone, while another had entered her shoulder. But as the lung was uninjured, she might recover. Telmark was what in peasant language is called a philosopher, that is to say, a combination of doctor, surgeon, and wizard. Upon the bed of seaweed in his underground den, he nursed the wounded woman, using those mysterious remedies called simples, and, thanks to his care, she lived. The collarbone knitted together, the wounds in the breast and the shoulder closed, and after a few weeks, the wounded woman became convalescent. One morning she was able to walk out of the Carnishot, leaning on Telmark. She seated herself under the trees, in the sun. Telmark knew very little about her, for a wound in the breast necessitates silence, and during the death-like agony which preceded her recovery, she had hardly spoken a word. Whenever she seemed about to open her lips, Telmark would prevent her, but he could not control her thoughts, and he observed by the expression in her eyes the heartrending nature of her ever-recurring fancies. This morning she felt strong and could almost walk alone. The doctor who has cured his patient enjoys a sense of fatherhood, and as he watched her, Telmark felt happy. The good old man began to smile as he addressed her. "Well, it seems we are up. Our wounds are healed. All but those of the heart." And presently she added, "Then you don't know where they are." "Whom do you mean?" asked Telmark. "My children." The word then revealed a whole world of meaning. It seemed to say, "Since you do not speak of them to me, since you have been with me for so many days without opening your lips to me on the subject, since you silence me every time I try to speak, since you seem to fear that I am going to talk about them, it must mean that you have nothing to tell me." During the course of her fever, she had often noticed that whenever, in her delirious ramblings, she had called for her children, the perceptions of delirium are sometimes acute. The old man would make no reply. The truth was that Telmark did not know what to tell her. It is not easy to speak to a mother of her lost children, and besides, what did he know? Nothing at all, in fact, that a mother had been shot, that he had found this mother on the ground, that when he had lifted her up she was nearly dead, that this dying woman had 3 children, and lastly, that the Marquis de Lantenac, after ordering the mother to be shot, had carried away the children, and here his information ceased. What had become of the children? Were they still living? Having made inquiries, he had learned that there were 2 boys and a little girl barely weaned, and this was the extent of his knowledge. He asked himself more questions than he could answer in regard to this unhappy family, but the neighbors whom he had asked only shook their heads. M. de Lantenac was a man of whom no one cared to talk. They were equally reluctant either to speak about Lantenac or to talk to Telmark. Peasants have their own peculiar superstitions. They disliked Telmark. Telmark le Caymond was a perplexing man. Why was he always looking up at the sky? What was he doing? What could he be thinking about when he stood motionless for hours at a time? Surely he must be a very odd sort of man. While the district was in a state of combustion and conflagration, when warfare, devastation, and carnage were the sole occupations of life, when every man was doing his best to burn houses, murder families, massacre outposts, and plunder villages, thinking of nothing but setting ambushes and traps and killing one another, here was this hermit absorbed in nature, enjoying absolute peace of mind, gathering plants and herbs, interested only in flowers, birds, and stars. Of course he was a dangerous character. He must be insane. He never hid behind a bush to fire at his fellow-men. "The man is mad," said the passers-by. Hence he inspired a certain awe, and men avoided him, thus increasing the isolation of his life. They asked him no questions and seldom vouchsafed replies, therefore he had been unable to get the information he wanted. The conflict had been transferred to other districts, and the fighting was more remote. The Marquis de Lantenac had vanished from the horizon, and war must set its foot on a man of Telmark's character before he becomes aware of its existence. After hearing these words, "My children," Telmark ceased to smile, and the mother sank into deep thought. What was passing in her soul? She seemed to have plunged into the depths. Suddenly she looked up at Telmark and repeated her demand almost angrily. "My children." Telmark bent his head like a culprit. He was thinking of the Marquis de Lantenac, who, so far from returning his thought, had probably forgotten his very existence. He realized the fact as he said to himself, "When a nobleman is in danger, he reckons you among his acquaintance, but let the danger pass, and he forgets that he ever saw you." And he asked himself, "Why then did I save him?" To which question he made reply, "Because he was a man." For some moments he dwelt upon this thought. Then he resumed the thread of his meditations. "Am I sure of this?" And presently he repeated those bitter words, "Had I but known." This whole experience gave him a sense of oppression, for his own action in the affair was enigmatical to him. His thoughts were sad, since a sense of guilt had crept into them. A kindly act may prove in the end to have been an evil one. He who saves the wolf kills the sheep. He who sets the vulture's wing is responsible for his talons. The unreasoning anger of this mother was therefore justified. Still he felt a certain consolation in the knowledge that he had saved the mother, which partly balanced his regret for having saved the Marquis. But the children. The mother was also thinking, and these two currents of thoughts moved side by side, perhaps to mingle unawares in the shadowy land of reverie. Meanwhile her eyes, gloomy as the night, rested again on Telmark. "We cannot go on like this," she said. "Hush," rejoined Telmark, putting his finger on his lips. She continued, "I am angry with you for saving me. You did wrong. I would rather have died, for then I should surely see them and know where they are. They would not see me, but I should be near them. The dead must have power to protect." He took her by the arm and felt her pulse. "You must calm yourself, or you will have a relapse." She asked him almost harshly, "When can I go away?" "Go away?" "Yes, when shall I be fit for tramping?" "Never, if you are unreasonable. Tomorrow, if you are good." "What do you call being good?" "Trusting in God." "God, what has he done with my children?" She seemed to be wandering. Her voice had grown very gentle. "You must see," she went on to say, "that I cannot stay like this. You never had any children, but I am a mother. That makes a difference. One cannot judge of a thing unless he knows what it is like. Did you ever have any children?" "No," replied Telmark. "But I have. Can I live without my children? I should like to be told why my children are not here. Something is happening, but what it is I cannot understand." "Come," said Telmark, "you are feverish again. You mustn't talk any more." She looked at him and was silent. And from that day she kept silence again. This implicit obedience was more than Telmark desired. She spent hour after hour crouching at the foot of the old tree, like one stupefied. She pondered in silence, that refuge of simple souls who have sounded the gloomy depths of woe. She seemed to give up trying to understand. After a certain point, despair becomes unintelligible to the despairing. As Telmark watched her, his sympathy increased. The sight of her suffering excited in this old man thoughts such as a woman might have known. "She may close her lips," he said to himself, "but her eyes will speak, and I see what ails her. She has but one idea. She cannot be resigned to the thought that she is no longer a mother. Her mind dwells constantly on the image of her youngest, whom she was nursing not long ago. How charming it must be to feel a tiny rosy mouth drawing one's soul from out one's body, feeding its own little life on the life of its mother." He too was silent, realizing the impotence of speech in the presence of such sorrow. There is something really terrible in the silence of an unchanging thought, and how can one expect that a mother will listen to reason? Maternity sees but one side. It is useless to argue with it. One sublime characteristic of a mother is her resemblance to a wild animal. The maternal instinct is divine animalism. The mother ceases to be a woman, she becomes a female, and her children are her cubs. Hence we find in the mother something above reason, and at the same time below it, a something which we call instinct. Guided as she is by the infinite and mysterious will of the universe, her very blindness is charged with penetration. However anxious to make this unfortunate woman speak, Telmac could not succeed. One day he said to her, "Unfortunately, I am old and can no longer walk. My strength is exhausted before I reach my journey's end. I would go with you, only that my legs give out in about 15 minutes and I have to stop and rest. However, it may be just as well for you that I cannot walk far, as my company might be more dangerous than useful. Here I am tolerated, but the Blues suspect me because I am a peasant, and the peasants because they believe me to be a wizard." He waited for an answer, but she did not even raise her eyes. A fixed idea ends either in madness or heroism, but what heroism can be expected from a poor peasant woman? None whatever. She can be a mother, and that is all. Each day she grew more and more absorbed in her reverie. Telmac was watching her. He tried to keep her busy. He bought her needles, thread, and a thimble, and to the delight of the poor Cayman, she really began to busy herself with sewing. She still dreamed, it is true, but she worked also, a sure sign of health, and by degrees her strength returned. She mended her underwear, her dress, and her shoes, her eyes all the while preserving a strange, faraway look. As she sewed, she hummed to herself unintelligible songs. She would mutter names, probably children's names, but not distinctly enough for Telmac to understand. Sometimes she paused and listened to the birds, as though she expected a message from them. She watched the weather, and he could see her lips move as she talked to herself in a low voice. She had made a bag and filled it with chestnuts, and one morning Telmac found her gazing vaguely into the depths of the forest, and he saw that she was all ready to start. "Where are you going?" he asked. And she replied, "I am going to look for them." He made no effort to detain her. Chapter 7. The Two Poles of Truth. After a few weeks, crowded with the vicissitudes of civil war throughout the district of Fauges, the talk ran for the most part upon two men, wholly unlike in character, who were nevertheless engaged in the same work, fighting side by side in the great revolutionary struggle. The savage duel still continued, but the Vendée was losing ground, especially in Elaette-Villaine, where, thanks to the young commander who at Dole had so opportunely confronted the audacity of 6,000 royalists with that of 1,500 patriots, the insurrection, if not suppressed, was at least far less active and restricted to certain limits. Several successful attacks had followed that exploit, and from these repeated victories, a new state of affairs had sprung into existence. Matters had assumed a different aspect, but a singular complication had arisen. That the Republic was in the ascendant throughout this region of the Vendée was beyond a doubt. But which Republic? Amidst the dawning of triumph, two republics confronted each other, that of terror, determined to conquer by severity, and that of mercy, striving to win the victory by mildness. Which was to prevail? The visible representatives of these two forms, one of which was conciliatory and the other implacable, were two men, each possessing influence and authority, one a military commander, the other a civil delegate. Which of the two would win the day? The delegate was supported by a tremendous influence. He came bringing with him the threatening watchword from the Paris Commune to the battalion of Santerre: no mercy, no quarter. As a means of compelling implicit obedience to his authority, he had the decree of the convention reading as follows: penalty of death to whomsoever shall set at liberty or connive at the escape of a rebel chief, and also full powers from the Committee of Public Safety, with an injunction commanding obedience to him as a delegate, signed by Robespierre, Danton, and Marat. The soldier, for his part, had but the power that is born of pity. His weapons of defense were his right arm to chastise the enemy and his heart to pardon them. As a conqueror, he felt that he had a right to spare the conquered. Hence a conflict, deep but as yet unacknowledged, between these two men. They lived in different atmospheres, both wrestling with rebellion, the one armed with the thunderbolts of victory, the other with those of terror. Throughout the bocage, men talked of nothing else, and the extreme intimacy of two men of such utterly opposite natures contributed to increase the anxiety of those who were watching them on every side. These two antagonists were friends. Never were two hearts drawn together by a deeper or a nobler sympathy. The man of ungentle nature had saved the life of him who was merciful. The scar on his face bore witness to the fact. These men represented in their own persons the images of death and of life, embodying the principle of destruction and that of peace, and they loved each other. Conceive, if you can, Orestes merciful and Pylades pitiless. Try to imagine Arimanes, the brother of Ormus. Let us also add that of these two men, the one who was called ferocious showed himself at the same time the most brotherly of men. He dressed wounds, nursed the sick, spent his days and nights in the ambulances and hospitals, took pity on the barefooted children, kept nothing for himself, but gave all he had to the poor. He never missed a battle, always marching at the head of the columns, was ever in the thickest of the fight, armed, it is true, for he always wore in his belt a saber and 2 pistols, yet practically unarmed, for no one had ever seen him draw his sword or raise his pistols. He faced blows, but never returned them. It was said that he had been a priest. These two men were Gawain and Simardane, at variance in principles, though united in friendship. It was like a soul cleft in twain, and Gawain had in truth received the gentler half of Simardane's nature. One might say that the latter has bestowed the white ray upon Gawain and kept the black one for himself. Hence a secret discord. Sooner or later, this suppressed disagreement could hardly fail to explode, and one morning the contest began as follows. Simardane said to Gawain, "What have we accomplished?" To which the latter replied, "You know as well as I have dispersed Lantenac's bands. He has but a few men left, and has been driven to the forest of Fougers. In 8 days he will be surrounded. And in 15 he will be captured. And then you have seen my notice. Yes, and what then? He is to be shot. A truce to clemency, he must be guillotined. I approve of a military death. And I of a revolutionary one." Looking Gawain full in the face, Simardane said, "Why did you order those nuns of the convent of Saint Marc le Blanc to be set at liberty?" "I do not wage war against women," replied Gawain. "Those women hate the people, and when there is a question of hatred, one woman is equal to 10 men. Why did you refuse to send that band of fanatical old priests, whom you took at Louvigny, before the revolutionary tribunal?" "Neither do I wage war against old men. An old priest is worse than a young one. The rebellion that is advocated by white hair is so much the more dangerous. People have faith in wrinkles. Do not indulge in false pity, Gawain. The regicide is the true liberator. Keep your eye on the tower of the temple." "The temple tower, I would have the Dauphin out of it. I am not making war against children." Simardane's eye grew stern. "Learn then, Gawain, that one must make war on a woman when her name is Marie Antoinette, on an old man if he happens to be Pope Pius VI, and upon a child who goes by the name of Louis Capet. I am no politician, master." "Try then not to be a dangerous man. Why was it that during the attack of the post of Cassay, when the rebel Jean Treton, repulsed and defeated, rushed alone, saber in hand, against your entire division, you cried, 'Open the ranks, let him pass through'? Because it is not fit that 1,500 men should be allowed to kill one man. And why at Cailleterie de Stillé, when you saw that your soldiers were about to kill the Vendian Joseph Bézier, who was wounded and just able to drag himself along, did you cry, 'Forward, leave this man to me', and directly afterwards fire your pistol in the air? Because one shrinks from killing a fallen enemy. There you were wrong. Both of these men are leaders at this present moment. Joseph Bézier is known as Mustache, and Jean Tretton as Jam d'Argent. By saving their lives, you presented the Republic with two enemies. I should prefer to make friends for her rather than enemies. After the victory of Landian, why did you not shoot the 300 peasant prisoners? Because Bonchamp pardoned the Republican prisoners, and I wished it to be known that the Republic pardons the Royalist prisoners. Then I suppose you will pardon Lantenac if you take him. No. Why not, since you pardoned 300 peasants? The peasants are only ignorant men. Lantenac knows what he is about. But Lantenac is your kinsman, and France nearer than he.